I think met James through Mark Thompson. I'm almost certain of it. And this would have been somewhere around 1980. And I was writing for the Bay Guardian from 1982 to 84, so I might have written something. James was an enchanted soul, and I was lucky enough to meet him at a time in his life where he was extremely happy and extremely, I guess, ecstatic, to use a word that he was very fond of. He was ecstatifying in his life at that point because he had gotten together with Joel maybe 4 years before that. And it's funny, I look at these old photographs of James prior to that period from the 50s and 60s, and I see somebody who's kind of dour and almost saturnine. And I never saw that in him after I met him. When I met him, he was this jolly, impish, silly, playful, brilliant old man who was having the best time of his life. He was in his, born in 1913, so he would have been in his late 60s when I met him, and then I knew him up until his death. And he had this charm and this charisma that drew younger people to him. He was sort of a hero to young gay men during that time. He was disseminating wisdom and merriment and joy through his poems and through his films, and through this role that I think he had taken on at that point in his life of this jolly big daddy mentor, kind of teaching those of us who were younger to not take life so seriously and to really embrace joy. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? And it's not. And James knew how to do that. And James was a guide for other people to do that embracing. Yeah. Did James say follow your own weird? That sounds like him. What would be James's weird? Well, you've got me stumped on this. I didn't know that he had said follow your own weird, but it reminds me of something that a friend of mine has on his refrigerator door, which is that it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And James had gone through a lot of changes in his life. And I think during that period when I met him, not long after he had connected with Joel, he was having a happy childhood. Well, my favorite quote of James is, I guess, I can think of a couple of things. We were talking about Fellini's Casanova. We talked about movies a lot, and I hadn't seen it, and he was describing it as a great film and one of his favorite Fellini films. And I said, God, I wasn't really motivated to go see it because it got such bad reviews. And he said, Edward, don't you know? The critics are in a conspiracy against the imagination. So, of course, I had to go out and see it at that point. And another thing that I remember, and this is kind of wicked, but it's also James, is that he had this relationship with Pauline Kael. I don't know if they were ever really lovers, but at one point she asked him to father her child. She wanted to raise a child on her own. She was 30, 40 years ahead of her time, and she asked James to be the sperm donor, essentially. And they had, I think, sporadic contact through the years. And James was talking about Pauline one night, and he said, I don't envy Pauline. She has nothing to go to bed with but her opinions. I think there was part of James that was envious of Pauline's fame and success and approbation. I mean, she was known during her lifetime as the greatest living film critic, and not only that, but somebody who had redefined film criticism and made it more vital and made it more reflective of the culture at large, and a great writer. And James was doing this wonderful work that was recognized on a very small scale. And Pauline never wrote about James. And I saw her speak once where she said that she regretted that she had never really found a way to write about experimental film and poetic film. She didn't mention him specifically, but he would have been one of those people that she probably had in mind, because she was concentrated only on commercial film. I think that, even though he was truly an artist and truly doing the art that he needed to do, that Pauline's success was probably a thorn in his side. I would guess that. Well, I'll tell you something really horrible that Harry Hayes said. It's not horrible, but at one of the birthday celebrations at the San Francisco Art Institute, when there would be a big party and James would read poems and probably one or two of the short films was shown. I remember that Pauline happened to be in town, and she showed up at the Art Institute. This tiny woman, probably 5 feet or even a little bit less, and she wanted to know where this reception was going to be. And she walked in, and Harry Hay was there, and Harry Hay, thinking that he was being very funny, looked at Pauline and said, "Oh, I hear that you and James had a child together. Which one was the mother?" Yeah, but I can't remember. I don't know how much usefulness I could give you there, because I don't know what I said. I would say that his legacy as a filmmaker is really just about synonymous with his legacy as a poet. That he made these films in order to trigger people to be more in touch with their emotion, more in touch with their playfulness, with their spontaneity. He wanted to encourage people to be less conventional, to be less conformist, to really listen to who they were and to enjoy their essence, an essence that they may not have even recognized yet because they were so involved in being responsible, conformist members of society. So he was a radical. I think it was 1968 he made the film called The Bed, and that that got a lot of attention. I think it was shown in art houses prior to the feature film. So maybe at the Surf Theater in San Francisco, which was the premier art house in the 70s and late 60s. I think The Bed showed there for several weeks or maybe several months, just sort of as a appetizer to the feature film, and that was very popular. Much earlier he made The Pleasure Garden, which I think is a wonderful film, and I think that had some, moderate attention. And then the later films, they all, were extremely beloved and well received by an audience that was a niche audience, a small audience. It's always hard for anybody working in that mode, in that idiom, to get a large audience. I mean, how many people have heard of Stan Brakhage or Bruce Conner? Not very many. And it's surprising how many people have never heard of James Broughton. Do I think people should have heard of James Broughton? Yes. I think he should be required reading. It would be great if in high school English classes people had to read James Broughton poetry. I'm sure it would cause great consternation. What was James Broughton's love life like? Um, well, I know that he was with a man named Kermit Sheets in the 1950s, and I know that he then married Susanna in the late 60s, something like that. I don't know if that makes him a bisexual. I don't really care about those labels. And I think that James was, from what I know, James's love life was probably troubled up until the point that he met Joel. In the 50s, he was with a man named Kermit Sheets. And then in the late 60s, I believe he married Susanna, with whom he had his two children, Serena and Orion. I don't think that was overall a happy marriage. I think it was maybe something that he had fallen into because he still felt that there was, maybe there was still some urge toward respectability or conformity. But it was when he met Joel, as he articulated so beautifully in his films and in his poetry and in his memoir, Coming Undone, is that it, or Coming Unbuttoned? That was sort of when he woke up. This was, Joel was a dream incarnate for him. Joel was this spirit. He said that Joel looked like he had always imagined Jesus to look. And Joel would probably be embarrassed to hear this right now, but love can, when you meet that really true and profound love, it's you're sort of reborn, and it's like you've come home at last. You can sort of relax. Okay, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for all this time. And it took until he was 61 years old to meet Joel. And I think he was ecstatic and jubilant about that fact for the rest of his life. It was a great gift. And it was a gift that he was very much interested in sharing. Well, it was only much later that I saw James getting angry. And I don't know how much it had to do with a part of his nature that had always been there, or maybe something that was just, late onset dementia. I don't know. But I had gone to a poetry reading that Andrew Harvey, who James had been very close to at one time, and Andrew Harvey had done some great writing on spirituality, and James was sitting in the front seat, and it was a large church, and the church was packed, and some really awful person had gone up to the front row and tried to usurp the seat that James had taken. And I guess there were some crosswords going on there. And I saw this happen from a distance, and then I approached James maybe 5 minutes later, and I guess he was still really upset about it. And I just sat next to him, and he said, "Well, don't sit there." And I said, "James, it's Edward." And he goes, "I know who you are. Don't sit there." And it was like, talking to somebody I hadn't met before. And Joel told me later that kind of thing would occasionally happen late in James's life. I can't explain what it was. Yeah. So, that big joy, that sunny Jim, that beacon of frivolity and frolic, I'm sure that wasn't all there was to James. I'm sure it wasn't there all the time. I'm sure he had great sadness and probably depression in his life. What artist does not? Oh, how do I think his work is relevant for today? I think it's probably more important than ever, because there seems to be a more pessimistic a more pessimistic mood in the culture, pervasively so. And a lot of younger people don't have much faith in government or culture or even the survival of the species. And James's writing is really about reclaiming joy and reclaiming, um, your birthright, which is to have fun and to be ecstatic. Well, that's an interesting question. If he were to walk into the room right now, the part of his body where the energy would be the strongest would be his eyes and his smile and his giggle. He giggled a lot, and he flirted a lot, and a lot of my contact with him was at a point where I was in my early 30s, and he loved flirting with me. He loved being around younger men, and so I remember being at Mark Thompson's once. It was just a small dinner party for Mark and James and Joel and myself. I think I was sitting on the floor, and James just very spontaneously said, "Oh, Edward, you look so adorable." And he came over and sat, kind of on my lap and put his arms around me. So to answer your question, yeah, it was in his eyes and his giggle. He knew that he had this great impact on people, and he enjoyed that very much. He enjoyed being the gay elder who made people feel better about themselves. James Broughton was funny. James Broughton was silly. James Broughton was playful. James Broughton was disinterested in. James Broughton was disinterested in normalcy. James Broughton was disinterested in conventionality. James Broughton was a very sensual man. James Broughton was a Scorpio. James Broughton had, uh, a dirty mind. James Broughton loved to talk about sex. James Broughton loved a filthy joke. James Broughton adored art. He revered artists. James Broughton. This was the strangest thing about him for me. James Broughton did not have a lot of interest in his children. And James, I can remember Pauline would send James photographs and notes of their grandson because Gina, the daughter that they had together, had a son. And James's attitude was, I don't know why she's sending this to me. It's like, I have nothing to do with this person. Very, very odd. And it's hard for me to reconcile that with all the other parts of James that I know. Well, I think the bed got a lot of attention because there was nudity in it. The images that I have of it is it a 4-poster bed? It's an old bed frame, and I can see it sliding down a hillside. Probably was shot somewhere in the hills of Marin County. And I remember some long-haired blonde woman being naked on the bed. And I think it was probably kind of recognized and celebrated as something that was emblematic of the time, the new freedoms of the late 60s. It was, a cool thing to know about it, and it was a cool thing to have seen. My favorite of James's poetry collections was always Graffiti for the Johns of Heaven, largely because I can remember him performing these poems at the San Francisco Art Institute when he would have his annual birthday celebration. So, I like every single one of them, but I'll read this one. It's untitled. All the world's mongrels are wearing fancy dress, and the top hats serve us warmed over marshmallows. Our pudding got burnt into peace and meal by the disheartened frolic in the political kitchen. There's nothing left to eat but a rumpled roast of finnegan, fribble, and fiddlestick. There's nothing on the menu but a leftover hash of hoodwink, bugbear, and flimflam. Even if there isn't any honest sustenance left, that doesn't reduce our need for nourishment. We are starving to death on hand-me-down falsies. Help! Help! Save the hungry souls drowning in a threadbare stew. Of course I can read the one on page 25. Oh! I'm much too dignified to read this, but I will for you. Nipples and cocks, nothing tickles the palate like nipples and cocks. Lose your appetite for clippers and clocks by trying a tipple of nipples and cocks. Up with your t-shirts, down with your jocks, tempt your taste buds with nipples and cocks. Don't riddle your brow or rot in your box. It's nicer to nibble on nipples and cocks. No need to be fancy or unorthodox. Just try a plain diet of nipples and cocks. Nipples and cocks, nothing tickles the palate like nipples and cocks. An asshole is a holy wonder. Don't insult an asshole by calling it a politician. Okay. Oh, here's one I've always liked. I am in the running. I am out there running. I am running after the election and the re-election. I am promising to be the most desirable man in the office. I am promising to be the most promising promiser of the year. I am running all the way. I am running on a rapture platform. I am recommending the enactment of national hugging. I am proposing a motion for increased kissing returns. I am legislating for compulsory fucking security. I am working on ecstatification for the entire electorate. I am promising unlimited, untaxable orgasms to every voter in the world. I am still out there running. This poem is called Quench. Quench me, quench. I parch with desire. Thirst is my fate. Thirst is my fire. I beg with my tongue. I pant with my need for the juicy joy of liquid seed. Drown my desert. Deliver me drench. I crave the delectable death of quench. I desire, I thirst for the wet of fire. This poem is called Ode to Gaiety. Go, gloom, be gone, glum and grim, off with drab, drear and grumble. It's time, it's past time, to come undone and come out laughing. Time to wrap killjoys in wet blankets and feed them to the sourpusses. Come, frisky pals, come forth, wily wags. Loosen your screws and get off your rocker. Untie the straight lacer. Tie up the smarty pants. Tickle the crosspatch with Josh and Guffaw. Share quips and pranks with every victim of grouch, pomposity, or blah. Woe to the bozo who says no to tee-hee, ho-ho, and ha-ha. Boo to the clean-cut klutz who wipes the smile off his face. Without gaiety, freedom is a chastity belt. Without gaiety, life is a wooden kimono. Come, cheerful chums, cut up and carry on. Crack your pots and split your sides. Boggle the bellyacre, convulse the worrywart. Pratfall the prissy poos and the fuddy-duds. Take drollery to heart, or end up a deadhead at the guillotine of the mindless. Be wise and go merry round whatever you cherish, what you love to enjoy, what you live to exert. And when the high spirits call your number up, count on merriment all the way to the countdown. Long live hilarity, euphoria, and flummadiddle. Long live gaiety for all the laity. Some of my favorite memories of that era, the 1980s in San Francisco, are going to James's birthday celebrations at the San Francisco Art Institute. This was early in the formation of the Radical Fairies, and I guess James and Joel had gone to one of the early gatherings, and there were several men in San Francisco who had started to identify as Radical Fairies, and they came to these events, these birthday events, and when they heard something that they liked or were excited about, instead of applauding and cheering, they would go sss. They were hissing, and I thought, what the hell is that? And I don't know how that developed, but that is something that still exists within the fairy world at a fairy gathering. If people want to show approval or excitement or support, they will start hissing. But James was just luxuriating in the attention and the love that he got at those events, and I would guess that those were some of the greatest moments of his life. Were you to ask him about that? Because he was at this point in his life where he was, extremely happy and extremely thrilled with what had happened to him late in life. And he would read poems, and people were just, it was like he was a rock star. People reacted so enthusiastically and so lovingly to his work and to the films. And it was an event. There was just this wonderful, joyous vibe that just circulated through the room. It was lots and lots of fun. And then people would bring flowers, and they would bring gifts, and it wasn't just the Radical Fairies. It wasn't just gay men. James had friends in the poetry world and filmmaking world also. But people would bring flowers, and then there would be a moment toward the end of the evening when James was standing there and drinking in the applause and, looking grateful and ecstatic. And somebody would bring out flowers, and he would act like he was totally surprised by this. And he would go, oh, one of those. And someone told me at one point that was choreographed. He knew when they were going to bring out the flowers. And he was enough of a showman that, he knew what would work. It's not that he, told people to bring flowers just for that. They brought flowers because they wanted to. But James was enough of an entertainer to know when it was going to work. Yeah. I wish he had had more of an influence on my life and work. He had an influence on how I see art. He had an influence on probably those parts of me that I don't often get to express in the world, in the buttoned down world that we live in. Being a gay man and a gay child before that, I was discouraged to be silly. And later on, I got a little more relaxed with that. And when I saw James as a man in his 70s being silly and goofy and laughing and chiding, I think that was, really, if not life-changing, extremely beneficial, extremely inspiring. Well, I haven't been working as a film critic for over 5 years, and so I've tried to kind of think of film more on a personal level in that interim. But if I were to, write about James's movies at this point, I would, I guess I would focus on the fact that they're so emotionally open, and they're so that they tap into such deep parts of our psyches and our souls. And even when he's writing about these humorous sexual poems, there's something that's very essential about James Broughton. I recently met a poet who talked about narcissist poetics and how what a shame it was that most poets do nothing but write about themselves. They aren't looking out on the world as a whole. And I think James's poems and James's films were not narcissistic, but they were inward looking, and they were lessons in how to be more gentle with yourself and how to learn or to pursue truth within yourself, and how to sort of celebrate all the potential joy that's in us. So many people are not able to tap into that, and James was a great teacher through his poems and films on how to realize that part of yourself, which is already there, and it's always there, even when you've got it masked, and even when you've got it tamped down, and even when you've got it covered with all kinds of self-protection. Why isn't James Broughton more famous? I mean, can you name a poet today who is famous? There isn't one. And in my grandmother's time, poems were taught in classrooms, and children were expected to memorize poems. I remember my grandmother in her 80s reciting something by Longfellow. And I think that was typical of her generation. And it's just become less and less part of our culture. It's become more and more marginalized. So you can't say that James didn't get the fame and recognition that other poets did. I mean, how many poets had that sort of status? Allen Ginsberg, maybe, and I don't think there's a single one today. Mary Oliver is a great poet, but how many people know who Mary Oliver is? Well, I'd say the same thing is true for filmmakers. He was working in the idiom of experimental avant-garde film. And again, how many people have heard of Maya Deren? How many people have heard of Stan Brakhage or Bruce Conner or Nathaniel Dorsey? These are wonderful artists, and they just aren't part of our mainstream culture. I mean, we're living in the American Idol world. And poems, I hope and pray that there's a renaissance of interest and appreciation for the kind of work that James did, but it's tough right now to spread the word. I think fame was important to him. I don't know if he would have wanted wide-scale fame that would have brought scrutiny and a reduction of his privacy. But I think James had a very healthy ego, and I think he had a very definite desire to be appreciated and admired and recognized. He wanted people to know his work. He wanted people to hear what he had to say. And I think that there was also, like I was saying earlier, there was a showman and there was an entertainer there as well. He liked having an audience. He liked having acolytes. He liked having adoration. I think he probably was constitutionally incapable of doing those kinds of things that he would have needed to do to be more famous. I mean, what was he going to do to, go Hollywood and direct Die Hard 3? That's not something he could have done or would have been interested in doing. he identified very strongly with a tradition of true poetics and true artistry, where the artist is examining one's soul and holding a mirror to life. And that's not the way you get famous. You get famous by selling popcorn. And it's, he's another breed altogether from a commercial filmmaker. It would be like comparing, I don't know, Proust to Jacqueline Suzanne, something like that. James was not Proust, but he was, he was something. He was a teacher. He was an artist. He was a role model. He was a mentor. He was an entertainer. He was. I thought about this earlier. The word trickster. He had an impish quality, but trickster, that doesn't quite describe him, because I think the trickster traditionally tries to upend things and catch people off guard and kind of mess with the flow of things. And James wasn't really that. He was somebody that just wanted to, hey, look at this, consider it in a new way, look deeper. I think it would be great if he were better known, if he were more widely read, and if he were remembered as somebody who kind of offered a wake-up call to the world, the wake-up call being enjoy your life, be true to yourself, and learn how to love, and stop competing so vehemently, stop running, stop aspiring to material success, and listen to your heart. Anything unpleasant about him? Well, that's not very nice. Anything unpleasant or annoying? With anybody who's that much of a star, you inevitably have to kind of play the audience a lot of the time. So maybe there were a few times that I would have liked to have had, the stage myself. But he was so entertaining, and I adore being entertained. So I never had a fight with James. I never had cross words with James. Later in his life, I think he became more reclusive, and he didn't stay in touch. Usually I was the one who had to make the connection. So that probably bothered me, but I think that's also very typical of somebody who's an artist and who has a whole world of who has a public life and who has a number of fans and admirers and What I like about James's poems is the humor in them, and also clarity, which was a big part of his artistic identity. Clarity was very important to him. He was always trying to achieve that. And there are so many poets that you pick up their work and you look at it and you say, I don't know what the hell this person is saying, and why should it be this hard? And why is it so arcane and so obtuse? And it wasn't that way with James. It was gorgeous language, and it was musical language, and it was clever and original and funny and sometimes very deep and sometimes sad. But you knew what he was saying. The message was there, which isn't to say that it was simplified. It was just clear. He would neologize, I guess you could say. He would make up words, or he would turn a word like ecstasy and expand on it. Ecstatification. You know, that was his way of expressing what was inside him, is to expand the language so that it matched his emotional truth. Yeah, I think he was a great writer, and I think I'm in awe of him that he was able to put there's just such the vastness of his his grasp of language and his grasp of different cultures and mythologies and so forth. All of that is incorporated into his poems, and when you read it, it doesn't feel like there was a lot of effort. You know, it just feels like it flowed, and that's an indication of great artistry when you don't see the effort. From what I understand, there was tremendous effort that he never just knocked off anything. He would write and rewrite over and over and over, and he was, a perfectionist. He really wanted the poem to be as good as it could be. I thought it was interesting that the James that I knew from 1980 on, who had the white beard and the white hair and that kind of twinkling sage quality, that James was quite beautiful. And there's even a naked photograph of him from that time where he looks amazing. You know, he was in such great shape. But more about his face. If you see the photographs of him from those parts of his life prior to the connection with Joel, to me it's almost like a different person, and he got more magnetic and more beautiful and more charismatic when he got older. And how many people can say that? And how many, gay men can say that they had that, the pleasure of having those connections with younger men? Most gay men are just isolated. They become invisible. You hear women say that a lot too. After 50 years old, they're invisible, and the people that they're attracted to don't see them at all. So James had this, amazing privilege of friendships and flirtations and connections with lots and lots of young men. And it kept him younger, and it kept him happier, and it kept him more vital. And, everybody should have that kind of last 20 years of their life. In most people's cases, it's kind of a decline. And for James, it was a celebration. It was a crescendo. All I know about his relationship with death are, the poems that he wrote about death. And he seemed to have sort of a Native American approach, is that there was an inevitability to it, and there was not something to be ashamed or resentful for, that it was really, there was something sacramental about it, or there's something to be embraced. It was part of your cycle. He also, in his poems about death, made a lot of jokes. And he had this phrase, "my creeping decrepitude," that he used over and over. Sure, even though he was having the best time of his life, there must have been something frightening about it as you approach death. And I don't think he enjoyed his infirmities. But I think it was a very healthy attitude toward death that he had. What's that line? God is the greatest fuck of all time? Or something like that.
Yes,
That's the
fuck of all fucks.
fuck of all